everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing something that's slightly different, which is a challenge of reading all of the Goodreads nominees for the horror category. I'm not going to read these before the winner is announced because that's way too short of a time and I'm way too much of a slow reader for that. So we're just going to do it like over time and like split it up into like 4 different segments maybe, and then kind of come to a conclusion about which one I think is the personal winner. So far I've read 5 of the 20 books, and these are the ones that I've read so far. So we have Witchcraft for Wayward Girls by Grady Hendrix, Bat Eater by Kylie Baker, Play Nice by Rachel Harrison, The Lamb by Lucy Rose, and Coffin Moon by Keith Rosson. Not to spoil the video, but I've actually really enjoyed pretty much all of these books, so let's get into them. First one I'm going to talk about is the first one I read. I read this basically as soon as it came out, and that's Witchcraft for Wayward Girls by Grady Hendrix. I love Grady Hendrix's horror, so I feel like it's no surprise that I read this as soon as it came out. And this essentially follows a group of girls who are going to this Wayward's home. It's essentially a home where unmarried or teenage girls who are pregnant would go and have their baby and then return to their normal life. But whether through their own choice or being manipulated and forced into it, would give up their child, and the child would be rehomed with a kind of married couple or someone that's deemed a bit more socially acceptable to be having a child. And this is set in the 1960s, I believe. So these are real things that happened. And I think even in the author's note, I read that Grady Hendrix wrote this book because he found out that this had happened within his own family. One of his family members had been to one of these wayward homes and had to give up their child, I think, which I think answers the question of why a man would be writing a book about teenage girls and pregnancies, things that he has not experienced. And we basically follow these teenage girls on this journey at this wayward home with their pregnancies and what happens throughout their whole time here. Needless to say, it's quite horrific in the sense of real life horrors in the way that teenage girls are treated. And I feel like in Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, I always struggle with that title, the real life horror is like women not being listened to and women being mistreated, whereas in this I feel like it's a lot more about being a teenage girl and the way that society treats and also perceives teenage girls, and the way that these girls are kind of punished and looked down upon for their pregnancies, whether it was a simple mistake that got them pregnant or in some cases it wasn't their fault at all. And it's also quite horrifying the way that the girls are treated and the way that they are manipulated into giving their children away, and that's just kind of the norm in this house. There's also lots of like kind of graphic body horror around like pregnancy. The childbirth scenes are so traumatic, and like I feel like it's quite accurate in the sense that a lot of people do get like trauma from giving birth, because childbirth is like a massive medical event that happens to someone. I was already put off, but I'm put off even more now. I feel like at times this kind of reads quite slowly, and at times it reads a bit more like a historical fiction with some horror elements thrown in. And I think that the witchcraft parts of this book were a lot less than I was expecting. I was expecting it to be more central to the kind of storyline. It would be a bit more lighthearted in the witchy elements, but it was actually quite culty and feral almost. The witchy parts almost just became another part of another problem that teenage girls had to deal with, the world being against these teenage girls. There's lots of things in this about how the girls were just not treated right. All of the things, the way that teenage girls are seen and perceived and treated. But overall, I think I really enjoyed this and I gave it 4 stars. Also trigger warnings for things like grooming and abuse and childbirth, because there's a lot of that in this. That's kind of given in the synopsis. And then next up we have Play Nice by Rachel Harrison. This is one of my favourite authors for horror. Rachel Harrison, I love everything she's done, and I think this is her best one yet. Essentially a haunted house tale mixed with family drama and the kind of exploration of kind of family relationships. So this follows Cleo, who is redoing her childhood home that her mother claimed was haunted. Cleo's mother has just died, and she had an estranged relationship with her mother after all of the claims about the house being haunted and all of the dramas that happened between that, the mother losing custody of them as children. And after her mother's death, she decides to flip this house and use like her social media following. She's like a house developer, I believe, and does it like on social media. So I think that she kind of like is flipping the house to sell and kind of documenting it on social media. She didn't have a good relationship relationship with her mother and was estranged with her throughout her adult life. So she didn't really see too much of her. And as she was a child, she doesn't remember too much of what happened in the house and what the haunted claims were. Her mother wrote a book about the kind of hauntings and what happened, but she doesn't remember, and she said that she wasn't going to read the book. So when she goes to the house, she finds an annotated copy of the book, and we also get to read these like pages from the book that her mother wrote. So it's like a book within a book almost. And she seems to have left one in the house that's annotated and dedicated to Cleo. So we kind of see that, and we kind of see the mother's kind of writing in it as well. And as she's flipping the house, she essentially starts to wonder if maybe her mother was right all along. This has some creepy moments in, and it has some like kind of like scary horror moments, but it's not too overly scary. I think it is a nice mix of softer horror with the kind of family dynamics and the family kind of drama. It's very dramatic. There's so much going on. It keeps it a bit lighter. I feel like it really mixes these two genres that I feel like you don't really get in a lot of horror, or in some horror, where you get that kind of character exploration, and we get like depth to the characters, and we get their flaws, and they're not always likable in Rachel Harrison's novels. I feel like Cleo isn't always a likable character in this, but she's not unlikable enough that we don't like her as a main character, and then we aren't really rooting for her. And I feel like this is what Rachel Harrison does best, is like kind of writing these flawed characters who are very like strong-minded. I really like how this looks at the kind of family dynamics and family traumas, and the way that things are kept from each other, and all of the things that come with that, and the drama that ensues generally with a house sale, but also one that comes with a history of being haunted. And I feel like there's lots of parallels between the kind of haunting of the house and the kind of like family secrets, and the kind of like drama and the familial relationships, as well as like parents and the way that they will twist things in their own kind of debates and arguments. But yes, I think this does a really good job of blending the horror with the kind of family elements. And I feel like if you're someone that's more new to horror, I feel like Rachel Harrison's novels are always really good. Not being too extreme horror, and having those kind of like more human, character-driven elements to it. I loved the pacing of this. I love there's a little bit of a romance thrown in, and it just kept me fully engaged. So I gave this one 5 stars. Next up, we have Bat Eater by Kylie Lee Baker. I think that this may be in the running for one of my favourite books that I've read this year so far. So I feel like that kind of explains how I feel about this book. This book follows Cora, our main character, and she's a crime scene cleaner. This is set during the pandemic, and during the pandemic, Cora witnesses the murder of her sister. She's pushed in front of a train right in front of her, and I believe it's implied that it was kind of a hate crime. And that from there, we follow Cora as she's dealing with her grief, as well as uncovering this kind of like mystery and these kind of patterns in the crime scenes that she's cleaning. There seems to be a targeting of Asian people and bats at the crime scenes. And Bat Eater is kind of like this racial slur or insult that was kind of around during the pandemic towards Asian people, especially East Asian people. And this novel does such a good job of blending like the kind of gory horror of the crime scenes and these murders alongside social commentary and this kind of like supernatural paranormal elements that also come along with this. And I think is kind of a really good way of like dealing with and looking at grief, as well as kind of including these Chinese traditions, which I think was really interesting and kind of really interestingly played into the story and the plot line. So as Cora's investigating this, we also kind of get to know her colleagues who are crime scene cleaners too, and eventually help Cora with various things. But we get to see like their backstory, and they're kind of like strange but likable characters, and we see like their flaws and how they've come to be here and what's brought them to this point. I just came to really like them, and I felt so invested in their lives, and I really loved them as characters, as being slightly different and, you know, unlikable in some ways. And there's some moments that are kind of like funny, where the characters will be like, sorry, I'm saving myself in this moment. But I feel like it's relatively realistic. That's how people are. I feel like in this, there's also a lot of the social commentary kind of plays upon like the horrors of real life. So like the racism and discrimination and ways in which Asian people are discriminated against and treated differently, and lots of other things alongside that. And I feel like that blends just so well with the horror and also the kind of exploration of grief, and especially when it comes in when grief is like mixed with complicated relationships that aren't always super straightforward. And I feel like the kind of paranormal elements are a bit more prevalent in the book than like maybe like the murder kind of mystery. I feel like it was so unique and different, and the blend of all these different parts I feel like just really worked for me, and I really enjoyed them. I feel like it made for such a unique kind of plot and narrative. So needless to say, I gave this one 5 stars. And then next up we have The Lamb by Lucy Rose. This is a cannibal horror, but it's very much like a domestic cannibal horror, if that makes any sense, where we're following Margot and her mother. And Margot is about 10 to 12, I believe, so she's quite young, and it feels like it really follows her as like a kind of coming of age tale as Margot starts to learn about the world and kind of question things and kind of come to her own conclusions about the world. And we see her kind of like worldview start to change in this. And I feel like the cannibalism is quite horrific, it's quite visceral, it's very gory, it's very disturbing and dark, and I feel like it's used almost as this metaphor for like relationships and love and the way that relationships can kind of consume you. There's also a lot of themes of like abuse in this. It's very much like this big metaphor for child abuse, it feels like, and the way that Margot feels. And I feel like it's really exploring the way Margot feels and the way that child abuse affects a child, because the relationship is obviously not right in this. The mother is a cannibal and she's teaching her child to also be a cannibal. So they take in these people, they call them strays, who are just kind of like lost people. They're like lost people who basically stumble upon their cabin, and it almost feels a bit like fairy tale folklore-y in a lot of ways, in the way that it's set in the real world, but some things don't quite make sense, and it tries to have this lyrical nature to it that kind of evokes the feeling of a fairy tale, where you kind of have to take certain things with a pinch of salt. That like it's not meant to be complete. It doesn't feel like it's supposed to be completely rooted in reality. It's supposed to have that kind of like dark fairy tale vibe to it. And some parts of this I feel like felt very slow, but I think that this is intentionally done, as I feel like we're reading from Margot's perspective and we're watching as her kind of through her eyes, and the eyes of a child, basically. She's an unreliable narrator. She's slowly starting to discover her world changing, and her perspective is changing, and the way she feels about things. And we're kind of like, I feel like it kind of reflects how mundane her life is and how she's told to kind of constantly keep her head down. She's kind of starting to question things and make sense of the world in her own way, and kind of like questioning her parents and what her parents say. And I feel like it really reinforces like the smallness of her own world. It was so dark and so disturbing, and I feel like there's this sense of like dread and tenseness that kind of like gradually builds throughout the novel. Some parts felt a little bit repetitive, and I feel like could have been maybe cut out a little bit, but the ending was so stressful. I feel like if you've read this, you'll know what I mean. Like the stress I felt at the end of this, very stressful. Overall, it really stuck with me, if not just because of it was so dark and disturbing. I think I gave it 3 stars at first because of it did drag and feel quite slow at certain points, but I think in retrospect, with how dark and disturbing and how much it kind of stuck with me, I feel like it's more of a 4 star. And then the most recent one I read is Coffin Moon by Keith Rosson. Coffin Moon is not a book that I'd really heard too much about, but it's essentially a kind of like horror. It's a horror thriller revenge story. It follows our main character Dwayne Minor and his niece Julia, who are kind of tracking down and going after this vampire to get revenge on him. And we also follow the vampire John Varley, and we kind of we get this perspective from him, and we look at his life and how he became a vampire, and like his motivations and what he's been doing and what he's doing while these other people are looking for him. And we kind of have all of this build up. In the synopsis it says why they're getting revenge, but I feel like I'm not going to mention it. So, but it's obviously, you know, to hunt down a vampire. I feel like it's obviously quite a traumatic thing that's happened to them. I thought this was really unique. I really loved how we get his perspective, the vampires, as well as these deep dives into the characters, and we really get to see like kind of their history, like their past, things that have shaped them, and all of the traumas that they've gone through. And they've gone through a lot of traumas. Dwayne has gone through, like, this is set in the 1970s, so he's come back from the Vietnam War, and he's struggling with drinking and struggling just with the stress and the things that have happened there. And his niece Julia is struggling with the arrest of her mother. She's really had a lot that she's gone through as well. Both of these characters have. I feel like sometimes you could get annoyed with these characters for acting quite rashly and emotionally about things, but I feel like when they've been through this much trauma, you kind of have to let it go a little bit. And like, what's a horror story without characters acting rashly? Let's be real. I feel like this isn't too character driven. We get just enough to kind of understand the characters' motivations and their personalities, and mixed in with this kind of action and tenseness of kind of going after this vampire. And I think it deals a lot with feelings of grief and trauma, revenge, and also just like reflection and guilt. I feel like this also goes through so many different arcs and different places that I didn't really expect, and different characters that come up that I didn't see coming, and I thought it was just a really unique take on vampires and a kind of vampire story, and I gave this one 5 stars. So those are all the ones that I've read so far. I think in my rankings, in 5th place I think I'll put The Lamb, because it was very dark and disturbing to the point where it was a bit depressing. And then in 4th spot I'll put Witchcraft for Wayward Girls. While I enjoyed it, it was a little bit slow, and some of the horror of real life was just a bit too much. And in 3rd place, I think I'll put Play Nice. And then in 2nd place, I'll put Coffin Moon, because I felt like it was really unique and not at all what I was expecting. And I was really pleasantly surprised by it. And then in number 1 spot, we have Bat Eater. I loved the mix of everything in this and how unique it was. And it's my favourite book of the year, so it wouldn't make sense to put anything else at number 1 for now. So yes, those are my rankings. Let me know if you've read any of these and which ones you think I should read next. I've kind of got a vague list of what I'm reading next, but I mean, it will change if there's any that you really highly recommend. Thank you for listening to all my thoughts on these, and if you like this video, give it a like, and if you want to see more from me or more in this series, then feel free to subscribe, and I will see you in my next one. Bye!